guys are all new faces. The folks that went on our Center Street tour all died of heat exhaustion. And
there are markers along Center Street.
yes, yeah. So we figured that this is a better way to do it.
Okay, and just one more thing because it's...
So just a little biology lesson or botany lesson. This is glossy buckthorn. You can see all these beautiful little berries on them, which are not edible for people, I'm afraid. But they are edible by birds, which are now spreading this invasive all over the country. Somebody should come and chop this down. I almost brought my loppers today, but I figured I'd get in trouble. But somebody should chop this down and get rid of it. For the purpose of it's an invasive, we shouldn't have it. But also, it's blocking this important stone. And I need to point out that the differences between Northeastern and Southeastern are deep-seated. The stones in Northeastern are about twice as old as the stones down here. What happened is once upon a time, the coastline of North America was out in central Massachusetts someplace, and there was a chain of volcanic islands that got smushed into the face of New England, and then another, and then another. And finally a fourth one came along. Northeastern was probably made out of the second or third one of those that smushed in. When the fourth one smushed into New England, a big chunk of what is now Southeastern and Rhode Island collapsed into a deep, deep hole, 1,500 feet deep down in Rhode Island, that then started to fill up with junk that washed away from Northeastern. And so by 300 million years later, we had these stones, sedimentary rocks, as opposed to the volcano-type rocks that you'll see up in Northeastern. And if you look closely here, you can see that some of the rock is very, very fine-grained, and some of the rock has chunks of stone in it. Here's some here. The bigger the chunks of stone that you see in this kind of rock, the more it indicates flowing water. So the stuff that has no rocks in it more or less is representative of a swamp or a lake that slowly lets sand deposit, whereas the rocks came when streams flowed through here. So alternately there were streams and there were lakes, and right where the glossy buckthorn is a joint between the two. And if you look over here, and we'll go in back in a second, you can see that this area here is much rougher. That's a stream, and on top of it is the swamp that came along later. These rocks go back 300 million years. Most of the rocks are igneous rocks and are squished into the sandstone matrix. But some of the stones are softer, and some of them aren't squished in as good as they could be. So if we come over here, this is not a very impressive example, but once upon a time there was a stone here. And if you look at this and have a small amount of imagination, you can almost see three little prongs, one here, and one here, like there's a salamander's footprint. Okay. Now that's interesting because there were salamanders here 300 million years ago. They were the top predator in Easton at that time, and they were about 6 feet long. They didn't run very well, so I think we'd be fine. But what's happened here is either a rock has weathered away or been broken off and just disappeared. Well, back in colonial times, nobody really knew this. So when they saw some of these depressions, they made up stories about them. And one of the stories is our famous legend of the devil's footprint. The idea that the devil one day decided to visit Easton, popped out of the Hockomock Swamp, which everybody was terrified of because it was so mysterious and so dangerous in the days before you could go in on the high tension wires. He jumped to a field someplace down in Southeastern near the regional school, and when he landed there, that entire field became completely barren and never ever had a crop grow on it. Well, the devil, being the devil, decided that he was going to take his apron And farmers in those days wore leather aprons to protect their clothes, and also as a place for their tools to be. So he's going to take his apron and gather rocks. We don't know why, but he was the devil, so who cares? All right. So he jumped from that barren field with a apron full of rocks, landed here, stepped on a rock here, and left his footprint. And then hopped to the other side of the field and left another footprint. Meanwhile, dropping off these rocks out of his apron by accident. And then he hopped over to Pequannock and disappeared. Probably still there. So what was this all about? Well, by the time that this story got started, there was a tremendous amount of controversy here in Easton Center, which we'll talk about in a moment. So a story about the devil at this part of town was something that a lot of folks would believe because there was so much controversy. Second of all, it was a wonderful myth to explain why we have all these rocks lying around. It was going to be another half century or more before people began to realize that there were glaciers that had dropped these rocks off. And besides that, having the devil visit Easton was always a good story to scare the kids. And despite the fact that this happened in the middle of the 1700s, the origin of the story, Reverend Chaffin, when he was writing in 1886, talked to some old-timers who in the early 19th century, when they were kids, were so scared of this particular area that they would drive their cattle by as fast as possible. Now, they may have also been scared of this area because, you know, the school teachers back in those days had birch rods as well. So it was a scary place to be if you were young folk. So people ask me often, how do you find the devil's footprint? And the answer is it's real difficult these days. The correct answer is right at the end of the fence is where you go. So let's walk over there. As I was saying yesterday, Mr. Menino, see how shady this is, and we have Vinca as the undercover. So this is not a wild plant. It's a garden plant that's escaped out here. It's wonderful in the shade. We're thinking of putting it into some shady spots at the Historical Society. If you walk through this fence, which you're not encouraged to, the neighbor over here doesn't want that to happen anymore. There's some flat rocks in here. One of those has the devil's footprint in it. Okay, sorry folks, you're not going to be able to see it. I did sneak in on Tuesday to just see if you could, see it, and occasionally you can. If you wait till the fall and the leaves are all down, and then you get a wind and everything gets blown away off the tops of the rocks, you can probably still see the devil's footprint. Otherwise, this one is sort of lost at the moment. Okay. The good news, as I told the early comers, is the devil hopped from this side of the field to the other side of the field, and over there you can still see a rock that has a very, very large open space that you could probably consider to be a devil's footprint. The one here really looks like a double cloven hoof, like a goat's hoof. That one not as much, but it really is a big hole. The real devil's footprint is something we call differential weathering. It's just that some rocks weather out faster than others and leave a hole. There's devil's footprints all over the place. Several people before the whole crowd got here were saying, oh, we have one in our town, or here's a picture from other towns. So it's not that unusual, but it's a good story. All right. So our school has been here since 1954, but before that time, as many of you know, this was the poor farm. And the poor farm sounds like a really kind of bad place. You know, if you were poor, you'd get sent to the poor farm. Or if you were disabled or handicapped, you'd get sent to the poor farm. But when it happened for the first time in 1838 that they decided to have a poor farm here, it was actually a step up. Because before that time, what you would do is you'd auction off the poor. Folks that couldn't take care of themselves would every year at town meeting or at a church service sit in the front and be auctioned off to the lowest bidder. Okay, the lowest bidder, because you would say, I will take this person if the town will provide me with such and such an amount of money. So somebody like this gentleman here, who looks like he could do a lot of work, would fetch a reasonably reasonably low price, because I could get a lot of work out of him. Okay, somebody like me, who's not going to be able to work all that much, wicked tendonitis, I can hardly bend over. They would pay almost nothing for me. Well, it was a for-profit thing, not a charity thing for most of these people who bought the poor. And so many of these poor people were mistreated, particularly when one guy in town decided to go in the poor farm business himself. And out on Bay Road, a man named Albie Willis set up a private poor farm, bought up all the poor people, and worked them as hard as he could while giving them as little food as possible, to the point where several of them died of malnutrition. And at that point, the community-minded people in Easton decided that it was time to have a poor farm, which at that time was very progressive. The poor farm idea was that people would be able to live here, and if they could work, they could help out running the farm that would provide them with the food that they needed, and whatever they didn't need, whatever they didn't get from the farm, the town would provide for them. And the records of the town poor farm are the most detailed of any farm that we have. So you can learn in a given year from the town reports how many cows, how many chickens, how many dozen eggs, if they had a barrel of vinegar. Anything you want to learn about this farm, you can learn about. The other function of the farm was, this was the place where you would send tramps. And tramps were people that were roaming the countryside, usually, you would hope, looking for work. So in Depression years like 1894, lots of people were out of work, and they would be moving from town to town looking for a job. And while they were doing that, they could get a ticket to stay at the poor farm for one night. And then after that, they were supposed to leave town. In 1894, 1,800 people passed through our poor farm. Now, some of those folks weren't really very reliable, shall we say. Many of them were what we considered to be hobos, and they were on the dodge, and they were stealing pies from people's windows and things like that. So the town fathers also decided to build a lockup that has 3 cells. And there's a dispute among historians, and I'm completely confused, so you can put me in the middle, of whether that 3-cell building still stands over here off of School Street or not. It has been seen by some people and hasn't been seen by others. It's sort of like Lorna Doone, where every 50 years it pops up, and there it is. So the center of the poor farm was back over here. This area was on the edge of the poor farm. Why was it on the edge? Well, prior to the erection of the school in this area, this piece was chunked out for a town hall. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the mishmash of school problems, of church problems when we get in front of the church. So let's move along. Good. This little stone wall, we're going to be seeing a lot of stone walls. This is a modern stone wall. You can see that it's rubble stone. It's made with a lot of stones from the general area, but some of these stones were brought in. Granite cobbles like this are not necessarily found that often here. As a rubble wall, it doesn't have a long life expectancy before the stones start to fall off, so that's a way that you can tell that it's new. We're going to be walking in front of this house to our right in just a minute, and that's an important house. It's the oldest house in the neighborhood. It was built first in 1786 by Reverend William Reed. Reverend Reed was one of the first ministers, not quite the first, after the end of our Great Church Controversy. And let me explain what that was. The Great Church Controversy occurred around 1750. The first settlers in Easton moved in down around Korea's Plaza, down where the car wash is, where J.O. Dean used to be, in that area, at the junction of Depot Street and 138, okay? And for a long time, they spread north and south along what's now Washington Street. But eventually, the folks that were at the northern end of Washington Street and the folks that had moved over onto the Bay Road, which was an old Indian trail and also had some open fields that the Native Americans had maintained, both of those people felt that it was really difficult for them to get to church. And it was important in 1750 to go to church every Sunday. Religion was a paramount concern in those days. And there was no separation between church and state, so the meeting house, which was over at the cemetery on Church Street now, was also the center of town government, such as it was. So the folks decided that they were going to move the meeting house to a more convenient location. They surveyed the town and found that the center of Easton is actually about where Blackbrook meets Depot Street. And they put up a monument of stones there. And the feeling was, well, we'll put it there. But the folks from the original village said that's too far for us to go. So a compromise was reached to put it across the street over here. But the folks in North Easton, ever the troublemakers, decided that it wasn't close enough to North Easton. They were willing to compromise, however, and their leader, a man named Eliphalet Leonard, said, if you will move the sills of this meeting house the length of my clay pipe, I will accept it and North Easton will accept it. Well, the length of a clay pipe was like this. But the people had been arguing about this for 5 years. They put the sills in and they said no. All right. So what happened was the minister of the church, a man named Solomon Prentice, decided to pull his people out and start their own church. The Northeastern people mostly decided to start their own church. And since he was the minister, and the minister was supported by taxation, they petitioned the general court to be the town, as opposed to the people that stayed here. The problem was that Solomon Prentice was a religious revolutionary, and unsatisfied with being a Congregationalist, he wanted to be a Presbyterian. So they petitioned the general court and said, we want to start a Presbyterian town. Well, Massachusetts has 351 cities and towns, mostly because of religious controversies like this. But in those days, every single town in Massachusetts was Congregationalist. So the general court said, no way, we're going to back these people over here, and you're just stuck with the issues. Reverend Prentice had a lot of issues. His wife was even more radical than he was, and she was baptized by a layman. In other words, she became a Baptist. The Baptists in these days didn't have a religious college, so their ministers came from the ranks of the members. And he was so shocked by this that he couldn't deal with it. So using his wonderful Harvard education, he wrote the fact that his wife was baptized by a layman in Latin in the church records, so nobody but him could read it. Well, this split lasted for 12 years, but the meeting house stayed here until 1817, when it was replaced by a church that we would consider the typical New England church. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the original church had, it was sort of like a box. There was no belfry. There was nothing like that. And it had doors on three sides. The pulpit was on the north end. That's up that way. There was a pulpit. The minister would have to climb up into it. There was a board that stuck up over his head to reflect the sound out into the parishioners. The front rows were set aside for old people and people who were hard of hearing. Then there were the boxes for the families, and you'd purchase your family box. and that's what helped support the church. And then in back of that, there were free seats for people who weren't church members or family members. The church had a second floor. We don't really know what it was used for, but a second floor had one set of stairs for men, one set of stairs for women. And supposedly in those days, the slaves would sit upstairs as well, and Easton did have slaves. So that's a possibility. Slaves and boys is what most descriptions say. Now, if you were a woman, most women would walk to church, unfortunately. But if your husband was wealthy enough to have a horse, he would ride the horse, and you would ride on a side saddle behind him. So when you'd be riding, hanging onto the horse for dear life, I'm sure, as it was going along, with your legs not astraddle. That was considered to be unladylike. In fact, it was so unladylike that even in Blanche Ames's times, or after 1900, Oakes Ames was shocked that she loved to ride astride rather than side saddle. Anyway, the lady would be riding side saddle, and when they arrived here at church, she had the problem of getting off the horse without, flipping over and exposing gosh knows what. So over in back of the church, there was a 7-foot-long stone and brick formation where the husband would pull up. It was 3 feet off the ground, which is about horse height. The lady would step off onto that, and then there would be stairs that she would walk down to get off the horse. The other accoutrement of this building was in the front. There were the town stocks. And the church was built in 1750. By 1738, the stocks were worn out and had to be replaced. We don't know whether that's because there were so many criminals in Easton or because there were just weathered a lot. But you could be put in the stocks. All right. Controversy. It took a long time. During the Revolutionary War, the minister had a wife who was an alcoholic. That caused all sorts of consternation.
People lived in Easton at that time?
At the time of the Revolution, there were about 1,000 people here. Okay, it wasn't, well, okay, it was Hickville, but it was a reasonably prosperous town because there was the iron industry here. People had the blast furnace down in Easton Furnace. There was iron making going up in North Easton, which is another thing that tends to distinguish our neighborhoods. So in 1782, there was this young man, William Reed, who decided he was going to get himself graduated from Harvard College. And so he went to his hometown and asked his girlfriend if she would come to the graduation. And she said no, because she knew that it was sort of a proposal, that if she went, that they would be considered almost to be engaged. So she refused. Well, William Reed was persistent, so he asked the next youngest daughter if she would be willing to go. Finally, after she turned him down, he went to the youngest daughter, who was 12 years younger than him. She was 16, and he was 28. And he said, would you go? Well, she was a little more calculated. Her name was Olive. And Olive decided that, yeah, I'll go as long as you give me the cloth to make a dress to look really sharp. So not only did William Reed get material, he got scarlet dress material. That's, a scarlet woman. That's meant the same thing in those days. But still, she was 16, so it was okay. The dress was made by William's sister. It was open in the front. It had a petticoat and an apron here, and it had handkerchiefs filling in here. So it was lace in the front, is what the description was, with an apron and red in the back. Beautiful dress. She went to the graduation. They fell in love. 2 years later, when he got the job here in Easton, they got married. She got married in that same red dress. And you would hope that they lived happily ever after. It doesn't quite work out that way. Their first child, Olive, named for the mother, died and was buried here on the property under a walnut tree, which location is now lost. Okay, which sounds very sad. The house stays in the Reed family for 3 or 4 or 5 generations into the 20th century. And now, as we'll see, it's a real shambles. So come on, let's go take a look. So as you pass by, the house still looks okay. This is the 1786 section, and it was added onto, and there's an attached barn, which we'll see. But as you can see on a closer look, things are beginning to rot away. The interior is even more in disrepair. The current owner, who is not an Easton resident, not even a Massachusetts resident, as I've been told, last used this as apartments for college students, and when they left, they trashed the place. So it's in terrible shape. You can see here there's a broken window at the lowest level. There's cats in here. There's all sorts of wild animals in here. It's a wreck, but it's also a classic house that deserves to be saved. What the town should do is take this by eminent domain and use CPA funds to fix this up, or convince a buyer, like they did at the shovel shops, to come in and take it over. Turn it into apartments, maybe turn it into condominiums, save this building. The Historical Society in the past has actually looked at trying to get a buyer to do it, but getting a buyer as a prospective reseller for a single-family dwelling, the disrepair 8 years ago was so bad that the house was going to cost him $500,000 to buy from this absentee person, and another $500,000 to fix up. That would leave him with $1 million house, which sits close to one of the noisiest streets in Easton. And the developer wasn't willing to do that. But I think the market has changed in Easton, and I'm hoping that this building can be saved. This way, you can see the gable up above that marks the original house. So the gable that we're looking at, the triangle that we're looking at, marks the original house. This is an important piece of architecture here, simply because it's a step towards the federal style. It's a skinnier house. The federal style homes, like the McCarthy house at 300 Center Street, which we won't get up to today, is really skinny. It's only 1 room wide. This is about 2 rooms wide. Earlier farmhouses had been much more boxy. So this is a trendy house for 1786. Then it was added on to by subsequent generations. The porch was added on. The addition in the back was added on. This connector to the barn was added on. And then you have the beautiful 19th century barn here as well. It's a lovely property. It was beautiful when it was maintained. And it's a shame that it isn't doing as well now. It has trees growing in the gutters, folks. I mean, come on. How long was it abandoned? I'd say about a decade ago, maybe a little bit more now.
Maybe a little more. Charlie Porter lived here when I was a kid.
Yeah.
He was a master carpenter.
Yeah.
He was probably the last person that really kept it up.
That's right. Yeah, and it's been deteriorating ever since.
I'd say it's been empty 12 to 15 years.
Yeah, and before that, it wasn't well maintained.
That's when it was apartments and
Yes.
college kids.
Yeah.
We've had a couple of calls from prospective buyers, but nothing's ever been empty.
Yeah. Once they get, they look at the outside, it looks okay. We can fix this up. And they get inside, and it's what? As far as I know, it's a person in Rhode Island who's difficult to reach. Okay. Eminent domain would reach him, because that would allow the town to pay fair market value for this, taking it for a public purpose. It's a derelict house.
Right.
So as a derelict, I think we probably have a leg to stand on to do that. So we'll see how that plays out. Later generations of the Reed family were all over this area, as you'll see. Many of them were also ministers. But sadly, William Reed dies after about 25 years in this house. He dies in 1809, leaving Olive with another daughter and 7 sons. The first son had been old enough to graduate from Brown University and another son was in school. And between the mother working hard here on the farm and the boys sending money home, they were able to get 3 of the boys as college graduates, which was unheard of. There weren't 3 college graduates in the Ames family at this time. So it was, she was a remarkable woman. And she is the first woman to have her photograph, first and only woman to have her photograph in Chaffin's History of Easton, Olive Reed. And we don't know whether she was photographed in her late old age or whether she was painted in her late old age by a very good painter, and then had that photographed. But she's the only woman there. Very, very important person, and we'll learn more about her when we get to the cemetery. So we're heading down the street. There's going to be 2 churches on the block, one over there and the one that we see over here. So that meant that there was a great need for ministers' housing. So this was a parsonage. There's a lot of parsonages floating around the neighborhood. One of the problems that we had as the Historical Commission was we wanted to survey the properties here, and we hired a person to do that. He wasn't as good as the people we later hired, and we need to resurvey, or they need to resurvey this area again. So we don't know as much about this particular building as we need to. So in the 1830s, this fight broke out between people who were believers in the traditional Trinitarian congregational religion, the same congregational religion that's preached over here every day, and the folks that wanted to become Unitarians. And a split evolved in the church, and some of the most prominent people in town, Daniel Wheaton from Wheaton Farm, Elijah Howard from the Howard family, one of the first families in town and a very rich man, and old Oliver Ames, decided they wanted to be Unitarians. So they went to the minister at the time, a man named Luther Sheldon, and said, "Mr. Sheldon, would you share the pulpit with other preachers so that we can hear alternative views?" And he was unwilling to do that. So eventually what happened was Daniel Wheaton, Elijah Howard, and Horatio Ames, who was 6'6" and weighed 300 pounds, grabbed Mr. Shelton and refused to let him get into his pulpit one day. And that was the end of the Congregational Church in the old meeting house. Okay. By 1817, by 1830, it wasn't the old meeting house. They finally broke down in 1817 and built a new meeting house, which would be added on to in 1845. We have a picture of that building at the Historical Society, and it was a beautiful New England church, very typical of that Greek Revival style, a very beautiful building. That building lasted until 1882 when it burned to the ground, and very shortly thereafter, this church, which was built by the followers of Reverend Sheldon, also burned to the ground and was replaced by this church. By that time, that church over there really wasn't in use because the Unitarians had moved uptown to Unity Church. Okay. Now, up until 1831, there was no separation between church and state. So what happens to the town government is interesting as well. They must have seen the handwriting on the wall when they built the new meeting house in 1817, because at that time they built a townhouse as well. When we crossed the school property and hit the street, that's about where that building was. And it served as the town hall for a while. Hard to tell how long. And it was eventually torn down. The Unitarian Church was there. When they remodeled in 1845, they built a second floor. This church over here has 2 floors also. It has a vestry in the bottom and the sanctuary upstairs. No handicapped accessibility, by the way. That's the way it was in 1882 because if you were crippled, people in the congregation would carry you upstairs. It was just the way of the world back then. So the vestry of the Unitarian Church over here became the place where town meeting was held after 1845, and the old town house was abandoned. Okay? Anyway, over here, this building is probably the best example in town of what's known as the shingle style. And it's a style where the look is enhanced by the differences of the shingles. You notice there's clapboards down below, and then there's the specially cut shingles up above, and then the normal shingles up above that. Once upon a time, just asking for it from God, there was a much taller tower here, which was struck by lightning and burned. I remember this being at this height being struck by lightning as a kid, and fires have started there. So Easton is not a good place to tempt lightning because we do have some terrible storms. Both the original buildings burned apparently because of lightning strikes. Anyway, the tower was not rebuilt to its full height. We have this height here. This church is part of the darkness as well as the light. I mean, religion obviously is a good thing. The folks that are here now are a active and interested congregation. But in 1924, the Ku Klux Klan met here. Okay, and we don't know the level of commitment on the part of the pastor at the time, but the one meeting that we have described was so big that it's estimated that there were 500 people here, Klansmen. They filled the vestry, not the sanctuary. They filled the vestry down below, and everybody else had to stand around on the outside here. After they had that meeting with the 500 people, they drove over to Pequannock and circled their automobiles and burned across. Okay, so that's 1924. In 1925, a bunch of Klansmen from Easton, and at this point no association with the church, drove over to Mansfield and had a parade to try to scare immigrants. They all dressed up in their hoods and everything, and they harrowed the town over there. Other instances of the Ku Klux Klan in Easton have kind of sprung up. There was even a teacher who was accused of being pro-Klan. The Ancient Order of Hibernians, the Irish cultural group in town, protested against this teacher in 1925 that she used a play that was anti-Irish, that she passed out a false charter of the Knights of Columbus and talked about the Ku Klux Klan openly. The school committee, whether they were being fair and honest with the teacher or whether they too were influenced by the Ku Klux Klan, did not discipline the teacher. And they rightly pointed out that the play that this woman put on was actually in a playbook that was used at Loyola University, a Catholic university. So the charges were dismissed. In that same year, however, 2 non-Easton residents were brought up on charges of carrying a gun to a fight between Ku Klux Klan people and people who were opposed to the Klan. They got off because testimony came from a special police officer from Easton who was in the car with these 2 guys and said, "It was my gun, and I just left it in the car when these guys got in trouble." So our special police were infiltrated by the Ku Klux Klan. And there's no doubt in my mind that that's true, because I spent a fair amount of my early career trying to get the list of people. And of course, no one wants to own up to the fact that their grandma or grandpa was in the Ku Klux Klan, except for one really nice lady who said, "You know, when I was a little kid, I was playing around in my grandmother's bedroom, And in the drawer, there was this robe and hood, and I just was. So we learned one person, and this police officer was the brother of that person. So clearly there was a Klan connection. So that's a lot to live down, and it's hugely ironic because this particular congregational church was also a key fighter in the abolitionist movement to end slavery. And we'll talk about that as we get to the other side of the street. So is there any questions? All right. So I want to point out two things in back of the church here. Number one is this area out here with the gazebo. If you're walking through the neighborhood, the church welcomes you to sit here if you want to meditate or just sit in the shade. And services are held out here during the summer. It's absolutely a fantastic place for church services. The folks here are really, really nice people, and they're working really hard to keep this gigantic church going. How many members of it? It's under 100 now, I believe. It's a very small church.
I think it's less than that now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was trying to boost them up a little bit. I was trying to boost them up a little bit.
Yeah, so this is a big building with a lot of maintenance for a small.
Absolutely, yes.
congregation.
Yeah. Yeah. And back in the day when I was going to Sunday school here, it was a much larger congregation. And what's happened is that this has become the mother of a number of churches. The Foursquare Church up on 106 is made up of former members here. And we also have a second congregational church in town. So there's you can minister pick between the two congregational churches. But once upon a time, it was large enough that in the early 1970s, they added on that new addition as their Sunday school wing, and it was full. There were multiple rooms over there. And prior to that time, they added this white building, and the white building looks a little strange. Look at that door up there, okay? And the reason for that is that this is part of the railroad depot that's down by Fernandes Lumber, okay? And that particular door would give you access to the top of open cars, okay? And it's very, very similar to similar openings at the Ames Shovel Shop. So this was moved up here after the depot closed. There were 3 or 4 buildings like this, and that served as a Sunday school room. It's been offered to the Historical Society, and I wish we could take it, but we don't really have the space for it, and it's sort of moldering away. But it's an interesting utilitarian building. The train reached Easton Depot in 1866. It had come to North Easton by 1854. And they built it through right after the Civil War was over from North Easton to Taunton. And if you wanted to ride from here to North Easton in 1868, it would cost you 15 cents to go there, which I think was a heck of a price. So I'd walk. But the depot and the railroad became our earliest school bus as well. Prior to that time, there were a few omnibuses that you could ride, wagons that had multiple seats, arranged face to face like a old trolley. So the railroad became a means of uniting the town. And then in the 1890s, out here where the sidewalk is, a trolley line came through. So the trolley line linked Mansfield with North Easton. Wasn't terribly successful financially, but does explain why there's a very wide space between the stone walls and the edge of the street here. And because, as we see as we walk up, because that was a wide space, during the bicentennial, the town turned this sidewalk from North Easton down to Five Corners into a bicycle path. You're allowed to ride your bicycle on it. You don't have to ride it in the street, you people in spandex. Get on the bicycle path. Get out of my way, in other words. But as most of you probably know, Center Street is one of the most widely walked places in Easton. There's walkers and joggers out here all the time. The other interesting thing about Center Street is it was once upon a time the second widest road in Easton. The Washington Street Turnpike, which was a pay road, was 4.5 rods wide. Center Street was 3.5 rods wide, and the reason it's wide and straight was that old Oliver Ames was head of the highway superintendents, and when everybody got stuck in all the ledge up in Northeastern, he hitched up 2 yokes of his oxen, pushed the plow blade into the ground himself, had somebody else steer it, and got the oxen moving. And he was the only one who could do that because only his oxen were strong enough. He was making fun of a guy that was running a tip cart. There's this fellow, Martin Wild. And Martin had his oxen and his tip cart, and he was picking up the stones that Ames was throwing up. And at one point he had to back the oxen up, and Ames looked at his stock, which wasn't very well trained, and said, you know, Martin Wild, you could back up hell easier than you could back up these oxen. The only reason I mention that is that Martin Wild is a forgotten person in Easton's history. He lived in the White House that Bill Ames used to live in on Langwater property right across the street from the NRT. That beautiful house there was the Martin Wild house. And Martin Wild was one of the town's abolitionists. William Chaffin, when he writes his history of Easton, pretty much ignores all the people who fought against slavery. And I don't know why. Partly, I guess, it's because 25 years after the Civil War, he expected everybody to remember who was on what side. And there were sides in the Civil War. Furnace Village was notorious for being anti-Abraham Lincoln. Just, hello, I'm from Southeastern. Yeah. Everybody, yeah. We only had the Klan, so I guess. But we all have our dark secrets. But other parts of town, there were abolitionists. And let's move up the street, moving towards the cemetery. How are we doing for time? I don't want to keep it too long. This is an interesting cemetery for a number of reasons. Many reasons, actually. One of the reasons, I have to say sadly, is that while our town has a really well-deserved reputation for preserving its historic buildings, the Cemetery Commission does not get enough money to do its job properly. And many of these stones, having visited these cemeteries, what a morbid thought, but I've been visiting these cemeteries for 50 years, and they're deteriorating. There's many stones here that you used to be able to read that you can no longer read. Thank God we know pretty much the names of the people on the stones. But there are over 270 burials here, and only about 100 graves are marked by stones. So there are a lot of unmarked graves here. And there are a lot of graves that are, like I said, no longer legible. But this is also a wonderful place to sort of get the idea of the flow of cemeteries. Your first cemetery in Easton was down on Church Street. It has slate stones almost exclusively, and those slate stones have death's heads on them, skulls and things like that. This cemetery was built in 1803, 50 years after the church had moved away from the cemetery down there. Okay, there's been a church right down the street for 50 years, but no one thought of putting a burial ground up here until they began to realize that young folks, not on motorcycles or drugs, were drinking alcohol and smashing gravestones. So there became a movement to build cemeteries that were closer to churches, closer to places where people were living, and that particular place got sort of left to its fate and lost a lot of its stones. Luckily, some of our most important gravestones, most beautiful gravestones, are still there. They too are deteriorating. But up here in 1803, the area in here, off the road, and off the road on the other side, and probably back to that Clark stone right there, was set aside as a burial ground. a neighbor heard that somebody was going to be buried in their backyard and said, no, don't do that. I'll give this area as a cemetery on my property. A man named Benjamin Bates, the fellow that actually built this Sheldon house down the street. And in 1854, one of the Reeds, William Reed, a descendant of Reverend William Reed, formed a cemetery corporation that added this side, the other side of the access road over there, and the biggest chunk out and back. All right. At that point, a number of stones from older graveyards were brought here. We don't have any death's heads standing here now, but we do have some 18th century angels. At least we have one. And it's perfectly appropriate because it's on the grave of the first minister of the town who was moved up here. So we've got those to look at. We also have a number of Civil War veterans that are buried here, like this grave here. The United States was very, very good after the Civil War to provide headstones for veterans who wanted them. The National Cemetery movement also began with the Civil War. Gettysburg has a national cemetery. Arlington National Cemetery started then. But for folks that weren't buried in national cemeteries, the families could get a headstone so that the graves of people who fought to save the Union could be commemorated and not forgotten, like some of the graves of people who fought in the Revolution. The people who fought in the Revolution, believe it or not, the people that founded our country, believe it or not, are the only Easton residents, veterans, who do not have a memorial. Stop and think about that. And it's not because we're not trying. We'll eventually get around to that. It's just really hard to determine the number of people who actually fought in the Revolutionary War. But we'll eventually have that. We do have these markers, and the problem is the government spared no expense. Well, they spared some expense. They said you can have a marble marker, all right? And marble markers were all the rage around the time of the Civil War, and from about 1800 to about 1860, when really good granite cutting machines were invented, and granite markers became the style after that. The problem is, of course, acid rain eats away the inscriptions on marble. So we have an unknown soldier here. There's a man named James W. Curtis that's buried here. We know now. We don't know why he was buried here. Because he fought for the 5th Massachusetts Regiment, which was a regiment that, when he was involved, was out for a very short time and just guarded military posts in Maryland. And it had nothing to do with Easton. No other person with any association with Easton was in this 5th Regiment. It was all north of Boston people. Okay, so somebody wrote to me and said, what's the story with this guy? Well, we found the story, but we need to go deeper into the graveyard to see some of these things I'm talking about. So come on. So this one is definitely the rest of the story. When I discovered this, I felt a lot better. And also very sad. It says, this is Olive Reed, the lady I was telling you about. And her husband is on the other side over here. This one says, Reverend Reed, daughter of Samuel Poole of Bridgewater. She was born in 1766 and died married in 1784, died in 1850, okay? Followed to the grave by a daughter and 7 sons, which till then had all met but once for 40 years just for their father's burial. So the family split up because she, as a woman, couldn't have enough money to keep the whole family living here in Easton. So they went this way and that way, and nobody came home for one big Thanksgiving dinner. The only time that they were still together was when he died in 1809, and then they came back in 1850 for her death. But the thing that makes me feel a lot better is, if you read down here, it says Olive, their daughter. The little girl who was buried under the walnut tree by the house was reinterred with her parents. here. So she's not somebody's backyard down there. She was moved up. This is the gravestone of our first minister in Easton. Not the first man to run a church. The first man to run a church was an elder. He was not an ordained minister. But Reverend Matthew Short died in 1737 at a relatively young age. He was only 44. This is his grave. He was originally buried down on Church Street and moved up here to hang out with all these other reverends that are around on the Reed side over there. When he was dug up, this is kind of creepy. When he was dug up, William Reed dug him up to move him. And if you're a Catholic, you know that one qualification for sainthood is if you dig the saint up and the body is uncorrupted. Well, that counted for something among Protestants as well, because when they dug up Reverend Short, they found out that despite the fact that the body had decayed, the hair was still there and looked like it was brand new. So they cut off a lock of his hair and sent it to one of his descendants and then reburied him here. All right. And this is not a death set. This is a cherub. This is the next style that comes along, and it represents a change in philosophy. You know, the Puritans basically said, aha, despair, you're all going to die, and you're all going to go to hell unless you can prove that you're one of the elect. Because the early Congregationalists believed in predestination. And if you were predestined to go to hell, it didn't matter what you did. Okay. If you were a good person, you would have a religious experience which you would then express to the church and become a church member. And God would, in great Calvinist belief, give you material success in many cases. And if you were materially successful, you might end up as a deacon of the church, because the deacons were the wonderful upscale folks that everybody else resented the heck out of. And being Yankees had their suspicions. So I have to share with you the idea, because Easton became an apple growing area. There was a term called deaconing apples. And basically people felt that deacons got ahead in life, not because God favored them, because they cheated a lot. And so you would buy your year's supply of apples in a barrel, and it was believed that deacons would put a layer of really good apples on the top, so that when you looked at them, you would find the good apples and the bad apples would be on the bottom, and you'd pay for a barrel of good apples. But many of the deacons were so paranoid of their fellow parishioners that they did something called double deaconing, which meant they put a layer of good apples on the bottom as well as the top, in case the parishioners asked them to flip it over to see the bottom. So that's that. Finally, the end of the mystery. Why is there a man named James W. Curtis who has no connection with Easton here? Well, the end of the mystery was that his mother was a man, was a man, that's a good one, only in Massachusetts. His mother, Lydia, had a daughter, and the daughter married here in Easton. And here's her grave over here. She became the husband of Amos C. Wade. Her name was Annie M. Curtis. And just to help out here, she named her first son after her brother, James C. Curtis. Well, if you do a little more digging, you'll find out that the C stands for Curtis. So it's James Curtis Wade. Okay? So when the sister, who lived in 1920, had her brother, who failed as a person, I guess is the only way you can say it, died, they moved him here from Easton. He never lived in Easton. He lived in Boston. When the Civil War broke out, he was in his 20s. He was a porter, a laborer down on the docks. And apparently after the Civil War, continued in that job until he couldn't work anymore. Ended up in the Chelsea Soldiers' Home, where he died of inanition and insanity in 1901. Inanition, I looked it up this morning, meant failure of nutrition. So the implication is he was probably an alcoholic. You would name this as post-traumatic stress syndrome and call it a real tragedy, except that the 5th Massachusetts that he served in basically did guard duty in Maryland and never got shot at. So it was just an unfortunate life. Now he's buried here in Easton. He's a veteran. He has one of these marble markers that I pointed out as we came in here, but I can't find it. He's got one of the markers that has rotted away and is now once again an unknown person. So as you walk through here and you look for the flags and see those marble things, know that one of them is this poor man who was brought to Easton to be close to his sister. He's in, if I had a lot map for this, we could find him. He's in lot 154, grave number 1. But and there's a headstone, but I don't know where lot 154 is. The ones back here, which you think that's the back lots, are not him. At least I can't determine. So as we walk forward to go out of the cemetery, you'll notice that we get back into the older stones. The slate was still being used from 1803 into the 1820s, and you'll also notice that the style there is not death's heads or angels, but urns. And that's why we call that period the Greek Revival period. The Greeks won their independence from the Turks in 1824, and the United States, as a democratic country, really got into anything Greek. So this is the grave of Luther Sheldon, the man that I've been telling you about for the last few minutes. And these little towers are actually really nice. They became real popular after the building of the Bunker Hill Monument. And this one here has a lot of detail written into it. And because of its design, the water hasn't damaged the inscription so much as you can still read it. It says, born in Rupert, Vermont, February 1785, graduated Middlebury College in 1808, ordained in Easton in 1810, died in Easton September 1866, aged 81. And then the inscription is getting a little obscure. And his wife is also located here as well. So this is a grave that I feel is of a man who was a real hero because of what he stood for.